Hi, I'm Erwan. I'm here today to talk to you about a Maya skill I've created for defining and deploying Snowflake Intelligence agents. But before we dig into that, maybe I should just start with talking about what Maya skills are. Skills are folders containing instructions, scripts, and resources that Maya can discover and use to perform tasks more accurately and efficiently. I've got open here the Maya skills documentation site that kind of goes over all of that and gives a lot of the info about Maya skills. The one thing that I want to spend a couple minutes on before we go further is just really to talk about some of these skills best practices that we've got here. They're really great best practices just at the highest level about how to approach building skills. You want to write effective skill descriptions, right? So you wanted to clearly define the trigger in which Maya would use the skill. Describe the scenario or task where the skill applies. You want to use keywords in defining the skill, including terms that are likely to appear in natural language prompts from users that would have Maya to trigger that skill. Make sure you also avoid overlaps in skills. So don't be creating a lot of skills that are similar in purpose. Try to have one single skill that does the thing, okay? And when you start to build the instructions of the skill, start with a goal. Begin with what the skill should accomplish. Provide step-by-step guidance. Some skills can get very complicated, and when they get very complex, you can turn those into numbered steps that Maya can follow. You'll see this in play with the Snowflake Intelligence skill, but using templates. A skill could be just minimal, just step-by-step guidance, but if it gets more complex or there's a certain way you want Maya to do a thing, including templates is a very useful way of making sure that Maya does that. Specify any constraints, right? Note any requirements, limitations, or standards that might apply when utilizing the skill. Now, that skill, you're going to be testing and refining it along the way before it gets to a state that you think you'd want to share it with others. So that testing should involve testing with varied prompts, right? Try different phrasings, making sure the skill activates when you expect it to, make sure it doesn't activate when you don't want it to. But more importantly, you're going to be iterating and refining that skill based upon the outputs and the results that you get when you're testing. That very first time you use that skill you've developed, Maya may not do exactly what you need, and that's the feedback loop into refining that skill so that the idea when you give that skill to others is that Maya will behave in a predictable way so that it typically gets the steps correct each time and every time. Keep that skill focused. If a skill becomes too broad, you might think about maybe breaking it up into multiple specific skills. So those are some really great broad stroke type best practices when approaching building Maya skills. So now what I want to do is take a look at the actual Snowflake Intelligence skill that I've built. Now, every Maya skill is going to be located in a folder in your project in .Matillion Maya skills. And in here, you can see I've got a Snowflake Intelligence folder. So that's where all of the assets related to my skill are located. Now, here's another best practice that I want to share that isn't mentioned in here, but I'm going to share some others along the way. But rule number one, use Maya. Maya is going to be the one that's using the skill you create, but Maya can be a really great collaborator in building the skill itself. I did exactly that. Maya was my collaborator in building this Snowflake Intelligence skill. Now, the anatomy of a skill at a minimum is always going to include this skill markdown file. This is the instructions that Maya is going to use when triggering that skill. When you put these instructions into your skill markdown, one of the other rules that I would actually mention as a best practice is try and keep this concise. You do not want this skill markdown file to be overly large. Let's say, thousands of lines of instructions. That's going to be overwhelming. You want to keep this skill concise so that Maya, as an AI, knows exactly what to do. In my case, with my Snowflake Intelligence skill, it's actually very robust. There's a lot of things and a lot of logic in it. But as I scan through this, you can see that this skill markdown is actually quite small. So what I've actually done is I've actually created a supplementary markdown file called this README. Now, this README has all of the very in-depth things that Maya is going to do all along the way of using this skill. The skill markdown in this case now is really more of an index, okay? You're going to see it right here is that the full documentation for the skill is in the README, but you must read the README before any deployment action. So the idea here is that there's different tasks in this skill. And this is more of an index and a table of contents telling Maya when it gets to a certain task related to the skill, go reference what exactly to do in the README for that skill. Okay. Now, Snowflake Intelligence is can be a very complicated thing, which is why Maya skill really helps to make it a lot easier. One of the more time-intensive tasks of building a Snowflake Intelligence agent is defining that semantic layer. Now, if you're not familiar with it, what the semantic layer defines for a Snowflake Intelligence agent is the tables that it has access to. What are the relationships between those tables? What are the dimensions and measures that are represented in the data in those tables? Verified queries around those tables, things that we know if you run this query, this is the expected outcome. We've vetted and validated this query. These are all things within that semantic layer that a Snowflake Intelligence agent relies upon to return to that business user reliable insights. Okay, so the reason why I'm talking about that that semantic layer is defining that manually can be very time intensive. It requires a lot of knowledge about the tables and the structures you're working with. Well, Maya and using Maya as a skill can really help to simplify that. So when you use the skill, one of the first things you might do is point Maya at some tables or maybe a pipeline that is managing the data in those tables, and that gives the context to Maya. But if you see here in my skill markdown, this mandatory checkpoint before anything else, the first thing is that Maya, when using the skill, is going to prompt the user whether or not they'd like for Maya to create a data model markdown file. And what the idea here is that there's definitely a human validation step in here, but Maya, what it's going to do, if you give it permission in this skill when it asks, is it can go analyze the pipeline that you pointed it to, the tables that are being referenced. If you've got a knowledge layer defined, that can also be additional context to help Maya build that data model. But what's really important about that data model is that it'll be created, it's documented. The intent is for you as the human in the middle to review that data model. Make sure it aligns with your understanding of the data and the tables be involved. That mutual understanding allows for Maya to build that semantic layer correctly and consistently. Okay, so data model, very, very important. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about templates because this is definitely something that's happening here. You can see there's a templates folder in here, but let me tell you a story about how this was built. Now, I was just talking about that semantic layer. And so when I originally built this Maya skill, I was looking at that semantic layer defined as a semantic model. And now that semantic model is a YAML file. Okay. Now, subsequent to that and this skill, it supports building that YAML-based semantic model, but now there's also semantic views, and the skill supports that as well. But the key is here, this is the progression of how I developed this originally. My intent was to have Maya go look at some pipelines and tables, be able to derive the structure, and just build that semantic model YAML file for me. I created a template YAML file that Maya could look at. What I found in that first iteration of the skill was that Maya was able to understand all the metadata about the tables. It had an example YAML file, but it struggled in taking the metadata that it gleaned from the context and creating a brand new context file. Okay, it got it, but sometimes it would have to iterate over it, or it would take some time. And so in that back and forth where I collaborated with Maya was that, you know what, let's build a framework. Let's make this a little bit easier for Maya. So we built a framework, and that's one of the first steps of this skill, is that it's part of a framework. And that framework is some tables, a stage, and a stored procedure that are used to help facilitate defining that semantic layer. Okay. Now, this pipeline is a template of how Maya would initialize that framework. In fact, Maya can inspect when it's running the skill, does that framework exist? If not, offer to create it. If it already exists, then say, do you want me to clear it out or just continue using what's out there? But what is that framework? There's multiple tables involved. So there's like a semantic models table. So there's going to be one row per semantic model that you want to create, but this is extensible. You're going to have maybe multiple Snowflake Intelligence agents based upon various semantic models. So this architecture will support that scalability and that growth, because you're going to have one main table that defines semantic models. This table of semantic model tables defines all of the tables within any individual semantic model. This table will define all of the dimensions within those tables that are represented in those tables. We've got a table for measures, the relationships between those tables, verified queries in those semantic models. There's also a Cortex semantic models table. What happens is we generate the semantic model from all that metadata, and that goes into this table, where it is also going to be version controlled. So, semantic models will evolve over time, and you'll have a full version control over all of those models. So that's some of the key tables. There's also a stage, because the way this is going to be built is if it's a YAML-based semantic model, it needs to upload it to a stage so that the Snowflake Intelligence agent can have access to it. So that's where that's going to be created as well. Now, the other bit that was complicated, I mentioned a little bit ago, was generating that YAML file. And so to help Maya here, but Maya helped me, because what Maya ended up doing was creating a Cortex-based Snowflake Cortex stored procedure that'll generate the semantic model based upon the data in these metadata tables. So that's what this procedure is. And again, it's something that Maia created, okay? And just defining all of my semantic layer information in the metadata tables actually made it quite simple to then turn those into semantic views. This could be extensible in the future if I want to integrate with maybe some other AI-based business intelligence tool that also has a semantic layer, but maybe needs it defined in a different way. Having all of that defined in metadata tables makes this really scalable and extensible, okay? So let's go back to the skill, because we're going to see kind of how the evolution of this goes. There's some questions that Maya is going to ask the user when the skill is activated. So we already talked about that first one, about whether or not to create that data model and validate if, as it's documented, if that's your understanding as a user. And then there's some of these other questions that'll be asked all at once. Like, what do you want to name the agent? It will give a suggestion. You can override that or just take the suggestion. The name of the model that's going to be created, that's also something that's going to be asked for. The infrastructure that I was just talking about, it's going to check, does it exist? And then based upon its existence or lack thereof, it'll ask, do you want me to initialize? I see it's not there. Do you want me to initialize that infrastructure? Or, I see it's there. Do you want me just to use the existing? There's a deployment type, because it does support both semantic views and semantic models. So definitely go with semantic views if you're doing Snowflake Intelligence. That's it's just a better way, is in my opinion, because now that semantic layer is defined as a actual Snowflake object, right? And like I said, this fully supports it. The other really cool feature this supports is that if one of those tables in your data model contains unstructured text, maybe it's chunked or vector document data, it'll see that and ask if you want to create a Cortex search service on that unstructured text, because Snowflake Intelligence supports that, where you could have an agent that not only does text to SQL based upon that semantic layer, a natural language saying, a question, what are the metrics from XYZ, and turning that into SQL to return results, but now it can augment that with a document search against full text data. I have an example where I've done exactly this, created a Snowflake Intelligence agent where there are metrics that were gleaned out of Lyft and Uber quarterly financial reports, and those all stored in facts and dimensions, and that's that semantic layer. But the actual raw text from those quarterly reports are also in a table, and they're exposed to Snowflake Intelligence. So you can ask questions of Snowflake Intelligence of something like, what was Lyft's Q4 2022 EBITDA metric, and what did the CEO say about that, right? So that's kind of a broad question, but that's really the idea. It's a two-part question where asking a question for some actual metric values, but augmenting that with contextual information that is represented in that full text. So really cool features in this Snowflake Intelligence agent, right? So I talked about the complexity of the metadata, and that's where some of these templates also come into play, because what you're going to find here is that I've got templates for both deployment types, to a YAML model or to the view. You also actually see here this data model template. That's a good one just to highlight, because when it creates the data model, I've got a markdown template file that shows Maia how I want that data model documentation to be written. And this way I get data model documentation in a consistent fashion. If your organization has its own standards around that, you could always swap that in. But there's some key things that are represented in here, right? The tables, the relationships between the tables, any text or document columns, right, for that core text search they talked about. You've got some examples, right, and about the relationships, things along those lines, okay? But also, in these templates is about how to deploy with these different deployment types. So there's a populate metadata pipeline here. This is really helping Maia to actually define the metadata. And actually there's some key things in here that I wanted to share, because there's a lot of different ways you could have done this. The first iteration of this, Maia was just trying to create SQL scripts to create all of my metadata. But what I've landed on is this pattern that is definitely some best practices. So one is using variables. So have Maia, instead of trying to generate SQL as part of that skill execution, have Maia use templates to do more of like string replacement. So I'm using variables here for things like the name of the model and the database and schema of the tables that are going to be in that semantic layer that it's going to reference. And those are all variables, because then Maia can just replace it in one place, and then those variables can be used all throughout pipelines and other places. So, and the idea with the variable usage here is Maia only needs to replace the variable default values, and everywhere these variables are used in these templates, they'll get those values, okay? Now, another key thing is that in this higher level populate metadata pipeline, what you can see here, it's doing multiple things, right? It's going to clear any existing metadata for that model. The idea is you're initializing it, right? But you might actually be modifying existing, and that'll work here as well, because it's actually the models that are version controlled. The metadata can be cleared out and reloaded. But each step in here that you can see in here, if I kind of go into it, is actually a separate transformation that's going to populate the different tables in that metadata infrastructure. So let me go into this populate tables one as an example. What we're going to find is that this pattern is actually used everywhere. Instead of using SQL, what I'm doing here is just using a fixed flow component, okay? And the fixed flow component is a really good one, because what it allows you to do is just define data in a structure. In this case, the columns for my table metadata, these are all the columns in that metadata table. So I've defined the structure. These are static in this transformation. But what Maia will then do when using this template is it'll actually fill out all of the tables in this fixed flow. It's like a grid of values at that point. But it's also going to use these variables, so it doesn't need to fill these in, because the model name, database, and schema, these are all going to be already defined in the variables. But what you're seeing here is all of the other information at the table level that Maya then will, that's where Maya will spend its time, is defining these things in the fixed flow. So again, we're avoiding Maya needing to do anything like defining SQL, and Maya could just be focused on defining values. So if we look, for instance, at the dimensions, right? That's going to be another one that follows the exact same model, where it's this fixed flow has different columns involved because these are now dimensions, right? But at runtime, when Maya is using the skill, it's just simply going to populate all of this fixed flow with the relevant data from the data model documentation, okay? Another characteristic of this, so that, let's say all that metadata has now been populated. We've got this higher level pipeline that says how to deploy the agent. And in fact, before it even gets to that, there's some rules in this skill that says after you've run that populate metadata, here's a validation pipeline that you can use, that Maya can use, that tells it how to validate if all of the prerequisites were done. In this case, was the metadata for that model populated? Make sure that the tables were defined, dimensions, right? Search source tables, all of those types of things. And this will gate it before it goes to try deploy the Snowflake Intelligence agent. And these are just some high-level checks to make sure it got that metadata for the semantic layer right. Because then what it's going to do is generate that actual metadata, create the semantic view. In this case, I am using that semantic view deployment type. It'll grant some table access. If there is a search service, it'll create that. If there's none required, then it'll just go ahead and create an agent. Otherwise, it'll create that search service as well as create the agent. But you can see in here, if I were to go in a little bit more detail, these are things that are all scripted out from Maya. And Maya can just, use variables where needed and replace things as needed. But everything is all scripted out so that Maya doesn't have to be generating anything at runtime. So this is what it looks like to create that Snowflake intelligence agent with, I've got a hard-coded model, but we could always change that, right? But you can see some of the characteristics in here, but it's also, here's the tool spec, the Cortex search. Here's the tool, the semantic view for the data analyst, the Cortex search service for the document search, if that's what's being used, okay? And so after that's deployed, and it's going to register the agent, grant the agent usage. So this is the full deployment. When this is done, you literally have a Snowflake agent that you can start to interact with within the UI. But before you get to that, you're going to have a validation of the actual deployment. Make sure the semantic view exists. Check that the table count in the semantic layer aligns with what's in the metadata. Things along those lines. Okay. Maya will also create a deployment summary for you. So this is another markdown that'll be created as an artifact. It'll show everything that was created. And one of my favorite things about this is that it'll also create example queries that you can then just copy and paste into Snowflake Intelligence, just maybe as part of the validation, but it's also documentation that can be shared with end users who want to use that agent. But it'll go as far as creating example queries, just for the straight up metric type queries, text SQL type things, maybe some other things that are just straight up document search, right? If you've got that in there, but also give you some combined queries, those two-part type queries, some examples that you can use there, as well as how to use the actual intelligence agent. Everything from using it via the UI to direct SQL access, Python, Snowpark, right? There's some instructions if you then need to update the semantic model, redeploy the agent. There's even scripts in here to clean up if needed. So things like, let's get rid of that agent. Let's clean up the metadata, clean up the infrastructure. All of that's self-contained in the skill. But here, at the end of the day, net, this is a very involved skill. Might not be the type of skill you start with, but this is showing the art of the possible. Some of the really advanced things you can do with Maya skills to make some really time-consuming processes, turn them into easily AI-assisted, repeatable processes. Hopefully, this was a really helpful walkthrough. Check out some of my other videos where you'll see this skill in action, as well as some of the data that I was talking about with that Lyft and Uber. Hopefully this is helpful for everybody, and looking forward to sharing some other tips and tricks with everybody in the future. Thanks.